Hi. So I'm going to start just by asking you, to introduce yourself, tell me where you're calling from, and tell me the name of your piece.
Yeah, my name is Mauricio Orantes, and I'm calling from Brooklyn, New York. And my piece is called Sedation with Me.
And when did you make the piece?
I made this during the height of the pandemic. And so I want to say it's like 2020, but it's something that I've been working on, I guess, for a while, just in bits and pieces. And the New Art City piece opportunity came by that sort of made everything come together. And
Yeah, I guess I'm seeing April 2021 as like the launch date. Um,
yeah,
and
so I was working on it for a few months, like collectively, and then we launched in 2021.
cool, cool, cool. And yeah, I would love to hear more about like what your workflow was and your process for creating it.
Yeah, largely was independent. I think I had all this time in the world during the pandemic. I had the opportunity to work from home, but I was also um, very much leveraging a lot of like the tools that I had in my place. The backdrop is my old apartment building, which was a converted hospital. It was a Jewish hospital, and they converted it into apartments. But aesthetically still had a lot of this sort of like feel of sort of like enclosed capsules. And yeah, I basically just was able to work independently without any hangups or anybody interfering because everyone was largely staying to themselves. So that was one thing that I don't think I could ever get from any space, of just not having interference.
That's really interesting. I mean, I would love to hear more about kind of the artistic process of things that went into it also.
Yeah, so most of this was reflection. Like I was looking at myself in this moment in time. So I was trying to sort of like look at where I was mentally and like sort of from a mental health perspective. And then what were the things that I was using to kind of get through those like initial months. And I realized there was like a lot of technology dependence, and most of my engagements with people outside in the world were like through Zoom or like some kind of experience like that. And I just put that into overdrive, like in a world where, let's say, we had the technology to actually have a manifestation of a personal avatar that would curate the rest of your experience. What would that relationship look like? And then what would that sort of feel like if the relationship shifted, right? And so I think that's what I wanted to communicate in this space of dependence, reliance, domination, fear, psychology. And I think at the core there was like maybe this sort of panopticon kind of conversation there, of like something constantly watching you. um and at what point do you like give up power, right? And so it is a conversation of all these things. And for me, in terms of the process, a lot of that had to do with my own feelings with how I engage with technology, my balance of that. And for the most part, I mean, I use a lot of technology to solve for, making this like happen. But I was also really just trying to marry what I was doing like from an analog perspective to digital.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And what was your practice like before the pandemic?
I was mostly focusing on like analog, mixed media in that respect of like sort of offline things. So I still do a lot of like film photography, but digitizing that, and then it's also just sort of creating like a glitch component to it, so it gives it a little bit of depth. And so like for me, that was most of it. And working through the pandemic and having this experience, it gave me more breath in this work. It gave me an opportunity to give it more oxygen. And largely, I think I'd stayed away from some of the 3D components in the past because it required a lot more computing power, and it wasn't as easy as sort of like WYSIWYG. And this felt like it helped bridge that for me really quickly.
Yeah, that was kind of my follow-up question is like, had you really worked in virtual space before, or were you sort of showing in traditional galleries?
Yeah, it's mostly been traditional, and I think this I've also like worked in theater as well here in New York, and I've met with some folks who started to play with the virtual space as like a new showroom because space is so it's a commodity here, and it comes at a high premium. Folks are looking at how do we bring this experience home, and also help activate, people who may be doing things independently, right? And so there was a lot happening here, and I was having conversations with folks, but this was like an immediate bridge for me, that allowed me to do something independent without, having to, you know, uh, solve for like, coding or building up these worlds like in a silo space.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear. I mean, my story with New Art City is pretty similar. Like I had met Don like a year before we started working together on this, and I was like, "Oh, I want to be a sound artist, but like getting space to do sound installations, like I would probably have to get an MFA." He's like, "Oh,
Mhm.
I could make you something that like arranges sound in like a virtual space so you can like walk around in it." And I just like never followed up about it. And then a year later, New Art City just did that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's been cool. I don't think I've taken enough advantage of maybe building on a second world. And it's largely just been because I have other projects and like I've just reemerged into the world and I'm like jumping in feet first. But I think when you look at an artist who has a grander vision, typical art galleries don't accommodate for everything, right? And so I think this gives you that like full freedom. And I've walked into other people's worlds, and I was just like, I'd love to see how other people's minds work and frame in this space. So I've seen really cool things from like just really obscure and like thoughtful ones, and other times it's just very pragmatic on how they've sort of just placed a 3D object into this massive place. And there's just so much more conversations that I feel we could be having, because this opens up more.
Right. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about how like installation art can be a really powerful strategy, but it's also incredibly resource intensive. But this kind of like opens up the ability to do that to a much wider group of people. Um, I want to talk a little more about like memory also, because you made this space about a year ago. Like, when was the last time you visited it before we talked today?
I want to say it was a few months ago, all right? And I think it was just because I was compiling some work that I wanted to show some folks. But in terms of like the editing space, I haven't touched that in a while, right? And not since this last time when I was updating the alt text. And it was sort of a really nice, I think I intentionally didn't want to look at it for a while because I wanted to see how I would feel after the fact, right? When we reemerged. And I mean, like now everyone's traveling. Now some people choose to wear masks, some people don't. But um looking at it now, I'm sort of trying to get myself back into that mind frame. And it's very challenging, right? I think there is a bit of sort of like removal and disbelief that I was in a space that was like 3 years ago, and it was very intensive, and this is what I was feeling. But it was really nice to revisit it, from a perspective of trying to provide color and maybe not walk someone too far into the to water, right? To sort of giving them like this is what is happening in this individual. Because I don't see myself as the individual. I just use myself as a piece to sort of communicate that relationship between tech, um, and whether it's sedation, or not, right? And who is the active, agent there.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, my follow-up question was like, how does it feel to come back? But that you seem to have like already answered that. And how does it feel to like visually describe your work? Or like, yeah, tell me more about the process of that for you.
It's a little uncomfortable, to be honest, because I had to go back and maybe even like synthesize my own thoughts first on paper. And I think that's when that's a challenging part, right? Like trying to get everything down without being too obvious, or like hit somebody over the head about what they're looking, because I want people to interpret this. Again, visually, it's meant for that, but I didn't take into account, folks who are not in that same space, right? So for me, I wanted to use language that was open, and directional.
Mm. I'm really excited to go in and see it, through our shared vision. One more question. How do you deal with archiving your work? Like, do you often return to old files on your computer? Like, do you have like an oldest file that you can point to in your mind?
That's funny. So I have like all these thumb drives here that like I actually need to go back to and load into a like a master hard drive that I have. So I don't do it very often, and I think largely because when I put my energy into the work that I'm doing, I'm really into it, and I like to sort of walk away from it, because I tend to beat myself up on like edits or on like color sometimes. And for the most part, I want to make sure that I can be comfortable with walking away with something and leave it the way it is. Um, and for me, it's been a good process, right? Like I think my therapist like helped me get to this point, but most of it is being satisfied with collaborating with the piece, because I think it's a relationship we have with the work. It's not like a one of control, and there's only so much I can influence, and I have to be okay with what I'm doing, because my full image isn't like focused on one product, right? It's on several. So I want to be able to have like the totality of this like speak, and I want to have conversation around like my work, right? So that's I don't revisit. That's a long way of saying like I don't revisit much of my work, and it's only because like I tend to have feelings about it. There's only one spot that only you can pick out that like you couldn't get just right, and so in order to avoid that like neuroses for me, like I try not to. But in the last few months, I've been looking at some of the archives from or sort of the new feeds that we've been getting on like the galaxy from the Webb uh, telescope. And I've been able to marry some of that with some old work that I've done, and it's given new life to some things that I've had in the archive, right? So I think when I am inspired, I tend to revisit very specific things.
I really love this question. I found this is the most evocative one that we tend to ask, or like everybody's approach to archiving is really, really specific. And I've heard, the exact opposite of what you said also, that like revisiting and reformatting is like central part of the practice. But yeah, I'm glad I asked it. Your answer was really interesting. So now we'll transition to going into the space, and I'll share my screen, and you can sort of tell me where to go, and I'll fill in visual descriptions for you.
Sedation with Me is a critique and captured experience on technological trust and dependency. In short form, experience curation by our own doing, manifest in avatar guides, manipulating fulfillment through artificial experiences, connections, creations. The dependency reinforced isolation became sedative environments, devoid of tactile experience and fulfillment. The exhibit and digital experience were inspired during the global pandemic quarantine 2020-21. Orantes curated the works in captured moment form as a memory bank, inconsiderate of linear time. The pieces frame technological ubiquity and break down relationship between informing body and informed technology.
Thank you. So in we go.
So this is the actual building I used to live in. There used to be some scaffolding. It's required by New York, but they don't really do anything. They just sort of keep it there. But the idea is that I wanted to highlight a snapshot in time, a snapshot in nighttime, where there's some lights on, there's some lights off, but every cell has its own story. We're walking into one, which is mine, and that's the doorway.
That's really, really poetic. And what we're seeing in basic terms is a black and white photograph of an apartment block. The perspective is looking up, and as Mauricio said, the some of the lights are on and some of the lights are off. And then we see this white doorway through walking away. So there's a white gridded floor and all of the walls are totally blacked. And there's a circle of different images with one cube image floating above the center of the circle. The exhibition text is floating in the center, and rotating text above, mirrored in black and white, says sedation. I'm gonna turn the audio down a little bit. It is really beautiful. So tell me more about these images.
So these images are memory cells. This is the closest way I can explain it. So they're selective, as if you were pulling from a memory bank. And again, these are moments in time for this individual. So they're highlighting spaces where we're calling out potential intimacy moments. We're talking about moments where the individual is looking to leave or questioning, their own space. There's moments where we have the individual entertaining themselves through art and creation, and the technology in itself is imperfect, and that's highlighted through glitches of the projection. There's moments where there's even the individual staring at themselves, revisiting or tapping into some of this memory bank, right? So it's reflection, and it's also surveillance, and it's also moments in time that are nonlinear. But because we all lived in this sort of moment, it's looking at time as a ball rather than a straight line.
One thing I love about all of these, I mean, I didn't notice initially that all of them are moving in some way, that they're quite slow and subtle, but they're all of these little light glitches, or this one has all of these different poses. And I really love the way you use negative space. Each of them, the images is mostly blacked out. Like the one that I'm currently looking at is a pretty narrow vertical strip of, I assume, the artist sitting on a bench under a red poster that says New York. And he's wearing a hat, and alternating between poses of looking down and looking off to the right of the camera. And it took me a second to see that there's another pair of feet and a hand holding the opposite wrist, but those are the only thing that it's like somebody's sitting off of frame. I don't know if that's you or not.
It is. And the idea there is that if I were to, if I were in this space and I wanted to look back at my sort of photographic journal of myself in that time, this is this person looking at themselves, right? And it is uneventful sometimes, but it's a moment in time, right? So assuming you have full surveillance, if you were to pick out one moment in time, what is that? And what does that even mean, right? And so it's sort of just a reflection moment there.
Yeah, I mean, I like seeing what you're talking about like atemporality kind of manifest, where you're embedding a future past in sort of a single artifact.
So this is an awesome experience where I was working with a model who was doing a lot of pose work. We were communicating virtually, and more times than not, like we would email each other packages of like images and things like that. And at the time, I was painting on wine bottles because I realized I was drinking a little bit more because it was just available to me. And I felt sort of like this weird shame of having all this like bottles around me that were reminding me of like my consumption. So I was repurposing a lot of them as like small canvases, and I would just paint on them. And this is one of those experiences where you're having to solve for some of that time and make a creative sort of piece here. And the glitchy piece of that is just designed to show that like it is imperfect, and sometimes even just a projection or something on the lens could throw everything off. But I wanted to highlight that. There's something that stuck out with me when I was younger. There was a Max Headroom. There was a show where it manifested something like that, where it was perfect up until that one small piece, and that glitch for me, I'm always looking for the glitch on something.
I love that. It's so great to hear you talk about these. And I'm curious. So, like in the foreground, there's this kind of like holographic picture of a nude body facing away from the camera, with arms out at their sides and like one leg, like foot tucked back behind. But it looks like you maybe composited that image into the image of your apartment with the wine bottle casting the shadow above on the wall.
Yes.
That's really cool. It's a great technique. Yeah, every single one, like the vertical strips on the black background, I'm obsessed. I really love, and like the shadow in this one is so dark, and then like the orange glow of the bathroom in the background. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, I think the idea here is also when I wanted to capture this individual in sort of several settings that the computer would create for them, right? So we're not leaving the space, we're just having projections to solve for the inability to travel, the inability of agency for this individual. And there's a tired sort of like pose to this to the subject that I wanted to communicate that after a while, like they're just you're numb to this, like it's not exciting anymore. And I think here there is another side to like being alone, is that how do you solve for intimacy? And I wanted to create an environment that had this familial warmth of maybe somebody you're expecting or you're close to around coming around outside of that bathroom, right? And I think that was that was like the full inspiration and the tiredness of the individual, that it's just there is one small bridge, and that bridge is big.
That's really beautiful. Tell me about this bouncer character. It's giving bouncer to me. It's like a man in a suit with a pocket square and a mask on in kind of a stern pose with his hands behind his back.
Yeah, so the whole idea behind this individual is that they're the personalized avatar. They're your guide through this, but they're also watching you, and they're also providing you with what you're looking for. So there's no need to leave, but there's also no need to go somewhere else for what you're looking for. And I think that's the manifestation of the relationship between tech, right? Where I can always put my phone down, but for how long? And I know that it's going to be there. It's watching me. There's so much happening in the background that they're taking care of, or that they're sort of monitoring without me needing to activate that. And so that's where the pose really is designed to create this sort of this sort of just omnipresent being that is devoid of warmth, is just as cold as a technology would be to an individual.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you use kind of the cold bluish tones for the glitch on him. Right now we're looking at Mauricio looking up at a wall, and this avatar is projected onto the wall and glitching. I really love the sort of like subtle like sci-fi aspect that you're playing with here of like impersonating the avatar that's like curating these experiences for you.
Yeah, and the technique I used here was really cool. I had this projector, and again, because I had accessibility to the full building, there were parts of the garage that were just not used, and it had this very cold, Blade Runner type of like setting, and I wanted to highlight that wherever you are, there is some component that will follow you. There's no lack of surveillance in this place, and I think here where we're trying to exit, it's even impossible there.
So you projected that image onto the garage wall?
Yeah, it's just this concrete slab. Yeah,
That's really cool.
and again, I was there for hours and unbothered. So it was the best situation I ever could have had.
So should we move to the next area?
Yes, let's move to the next area.
So now we're in this elevator surrounded by the avatar glitching through the door. And there's one where Mauricio is leaning up against the wall, like superimposed. So this is kind of this like transitional zone.
Yes, this is the highlight there is the individual in self-defeat, right? The idea that you can't escape this. And that was projected on an elevator. Again, in a floor space where you're sort of not sure if he's leaving or coming back. And I wanted to communicate a little bit of that of that relationship, whether this individual can leave or wants to leave, but there is really it's up to the individual here at this point, looking at this or reading this, to feel what's their relationship with tech, what's their dependency on, and can you really exercise full freedom here.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like the Bardo loop where the door out leads back into the same room.
Exactly. Yes, that's 100% what the motivation here was.
So now the avatar is here standing in front of a gilded framed image um, of a female figure on a plinth posing in black and white in sort of a natural scene with a little bridge leading off into some bramble. And there's this grayscale ring that goes from black to white, um, like rotating through the frame.
So this is a new space where, again, it was gilded intentionally in sort of like a tacky manner, because in many, like in a digital world, you can almost create your own world. You can create anything, any object, and so there isn't any heritage to it. There isn't any warmth to it. It's just what, let's just say, technology would decide to, a very immature AI would use to decorate your home. And so this is kind of like a frame used, and I think the idea behind the oscillating uh, black and white ring is that there is some kind of component that is waiting to load, right? So the image in the back is a placeholder, again, just from an AI giving you a decorative piece. And there is something that we're waiting for to load, but it's always gonna load in perpetuity. So if you stand here for long enough, I mean, you'll realize that it's not gonna move. But that's what I wanted to communicate, is there is a imperfection there, and that the glitch is never going to get you to the next sort of feeling, the next scene, the next presentation. And I think that's sort of like edging the viewer here. That's the experience. It's just one of edging.
Yeah, it was definitely giving loading screen. So now we have a scene of like a low kind of mid-century house. It's at night. We're in the backyard. There's some patio furniture in the foreground, and these like amber lights are kind of a little overexposed and like blowing out the scene underneath this awning of the house. and I see it's called Beach House.
Yeah, the inspiration behind this was a moment in time for me personally. I went out to Long Island on the North Fork in this small town called Greenport, and it was mid-century motel, hadn't changed since like the 50s, wood panel everything, and it's no longer there, which sucks, but I was able to capture that. And it wanted to what I wanted to communicate here is more of that projection of false intimacy and comfort that this AI is creating for the individual. So for the subject, it's giving you flexibility here, it's giving you options, but you're not going anywhere. And so uh, again, going back to the feeling of having someone wait for you, right? That little sort of warmth of not being alone, and they're just around the bend, but you can't really reach them. You can't really talk to them. And that's what I wanted to highlight here is that even in diversity of scenery in space, there's still nothing there for you other than yourself and, you know, trying to transport yourself into a different world without having to leave the space.
Totally. Oh, and we have one behind us here too. So the avatar is glitching at the door. And we see the individual's shadow projected on the wall, and in the foreground, you see them from behind sitting in a chair. And then there seems to be a baseball game on the TV. Does that say Philly?
Yes. So the juxtaposition of both images is designed to show that like there's literal ennui. There is no more regard for participating in this anymore. It's the individual turning his back basically on like this sort of faux setting, and you are just numb to all this experience now. So if you were to be in a space that's fully immersive, yet you choose to watch television, there is some sort of, withdrawal there at that point. So you don't know if it's a power exchange there. This doesn't matter to me anymore, or that they're so far into this numb space that the sensation's gone, that the role play is gone. And so this is more of a juxtaposition piece of like having that sort of moment where you're over the other side.
Totally. And I'm curious because the individual is wearing this trilby in every shot. And it's kind of interesting to me just because it's like wearing a hat indoors when you're like not seeing anyone. Was that intentional?
And I chose black intentionally because black's neutral, and it's also like a uniform. If we lived in a world where this was how we engage with the rest of the world, there has to be some uniformity, and I wanted to highlight that with the individual. And you don't really know, again, it's looking at time as a ball rather than like a linear piece here. So if it were uniform, it could be any time, it could be any day, it could be any year. But I think it's the relationship I wanted to highlight through all this.
It's really interesting. I'm glad I asked. Um, do we have any zone that we haven't seen yet?
No, that's it. I think with I think just calling out, yeah, the relationship in this room is probably the most obvious one that is designed to bring maybe the full point home of, how does the viewer look or feel about like their relationship with tech and all that. But outside of that, this is two rooms and that's it.